Your dog has been watching the door since you left, not because it's bored, not out of habit, because somewhere in the architecture of its brain, it is running a calculation about whether you're coming back, whether you still exist. The science of what actually happens inside an animal when you disappear is not what most people expect, and it changes what you think you mean to them. Most people draw a clean line. Humans grieve. Animals adapt. We have memories that persist across time, emotional attachments that survive absence, an inner world that keeps running even when the thing it's oriented around disappears. Animals, the assumption goes, live in the present. When you leave, you leave. The world reorganizes around your absence and they move on. That's a clean idea. It's also not what the data shows, start with memory, because missing something requires remembering it. And for a long time, the scientific consensus was that animals operated on associative memory only. They remembered that a thing produced an outcome. Food here, danger there, safe route, unsafe route. Not the thing itself, not the specific texture of a presence, just the pattern it left behind. That consensus broke in 2006. Researchers at the University of Chicago presented chimpanzees with photographs of individuals they hadn't seen in over 2 decades. Not images of food, not images of threats, images of specific faces. Chimpanzees that had lived alongside these individuals decades earlier looked longer at familiar faces than unfamiliar ones. Not just longer, significantly longer. With the specific sustained attention the brain produces when it's doing something more than pattern matching, when it's recognizing. The chimps remembered specific individuals across a gap of time longer than most human friendships last. The researchers called it long-term social memory. What they were describing, carefully, in the language of neuroscience, was something that in any other context we would simply call remembering someone. But memory alone isn't missing. You can remember something without its absence hurting you. The harder question is what happens to the body when the remembered thing stops appearing. In 2016, researchers at the University of Lincoln published a study that has been quietly reframing how scientists talk about animal attachment ever since. They measured cortisol levels in domestic dogs across different separation conditions. Dogs left alone, dogs left with a stranger, dogs left with a familiar human who wasn't their primary attachment figure, and dogs separated from the specific person they were bonded to. The cortisol profiles were not the same. The dogs separated from their bonded person showed stress hormone levels that didn't just spike, they stayed elevated. The body wasn't registering absence as inconvenience. It was registering it as a sustained threat. The same chemical signal the brain sends when something is wrong, when something that should be present isn't. The body, running its ancient accounting system, had calculated a deficit, and it kept recalculating. This is the part that should sit with you. Cortisol doesn't lie. It isn't sentiment. It isn't projection. It's a measurable molecule produced in measurable quantities in response to measurable conditions. And the condition that produced it in those dogs wasn't hunger or cold or physical danger. It was the specific absence of one specific individual, which means the body had encoded that individual as something important enough to register their disappearance as a threat to its own stability. It goes further than dogs. In 2018, researchers studying wild wolf populations in Yellowstone documented something that didn't fit the standard behavioral models. When a bonded pair was separated, not through death but through territorial displacement, the remaining wolf showed changes that went beyond altered patrol routes or shifts in hunting behavior. It showed reduced food intake, disrupted sleep cycles, and a measurable decrease in social engagement with the rest of the pack. Behaviors the researchers described carefully as consistent with a grief response in mammals. They were careful with that phrasing. The field is always careful with that phrasing, but the behaviors were there, documented, repeated across multiple cases. An animal alone in a territory it had shared, moving differently through it, sleeping less, eating less, present in the landscape but oriented around something no longer in it. Elephants do something that sits outside even this framework. Research by Joyce Poole at Elephant Voices, drawing on decades of field observation in Amboseli, documented cases of elephants returning repeatedly to the location where a family member died. Not once to investigate, repeatedly, over months, sometimes over years, standing at the site, touching the bones with their trunks if any remained, arriving, staying for a period that served no obvious survival function, and leaving. The elephant wasn't hunting there. It wasn't seeking water or shelter. It was going back to a place where something had ended. And the fact that it kept going back suggests something was pulling it there, something encoded in whatever the elephant carried of that individual. Not a ghost, not a superstition. A memory with enough weight to generate movement toward it long after the practical reason for that movement was gone. What the science is building toward carefully, without committing to language it can't defend, is this: certain animals don't just remember individuals, they carry them. The absence of a bonded individual registers in the body as a condition to be resolved, a gap the system keeps checking for and not finding. Whether that constitutes missing someone in the way you mean when you use that word is a question the data cannot fully answer. The interior of those animals is not accessible to us. The cortisol is. The behavior is. The long return to a place where someone used to be. All of that is measurable. What it feels like from the inside, if it feels like anything, is the part that stays out of reach. There is one more piece. In 2020, researchers studying zebra finches, small birds that form lifelong pair bonds, found that the vocalizations of a bonded pair synchronize over time. The birds develop shared calls, specific patterns that exist between that pair and no other. When one bird was removed, the remaining bird's calls changed, not randomly. They shifted toward the shared pattern, as if producing the call the absent bird would have answered, calling into a silence, waiting for something that didn't come back. A small bird in a lab, singing half of a song that no longer had another half. Your dog has been watching the door since you left, not because it expects you at any specific moment, because the body keeps a record of what belongs in its world and what's currently missing from it. And the door is the place where missing things have historically stopped being missing. The animal at the door isn't waiting the way you wait for a delayed train. It's waiting the way a body waits when something it was calibrated around has temporarily disappeared from the world it knows. It doesn't have a word for what it's doing. Neither do we, really. We just recognize the shape of it. We felt it too. What the research gives us is mechanism. Cortisol curves and vocalization patterns and behavioral disruptions that map onto something we recognize from our own interior experience. What it can't give us is certainty about what any of that is like from inside the animal. Whether the wolf moving through a familiar territory with something missing from it is experiencing something that deserves the word we'd use for it. Whether the elephant at the site of the bones is doing something that deserves the word we'd use for that. The researchers who have spent careers on this question don't close it. The animals don't answer it. What stays when you look at all of it together is the outline of something, the shape of an absence that registers, that persists, that pulls certain animals back to certain places for reasons that stopped being practical a long time ago. You left. Something noticed. Something kept a record. Whether it misses you the way you'd miss it is a question the science is still working on. But that it registers your absence as a condition that hasn't been resolved yet. That part, at least, is no longer a question.